Hello, my name's Alexander White, and this week I wanted to just share with you some tips on how to solve phase relationship issues when you're doing multi-mic recording setups like drums, acoustic guitars, maybe electric guitar amps if you're using 2 amps with a mic on each amp, or you're just using 1 amp and you're just positioning 2 mics right up in front of it. The problem is if you don't check for your phase relationships, you'll get a really weak sound. And the reason for that is, let's say you're using 2 microphones and you set, let's use a drum kit for an example because it's such an easy one to do, and you set your mics up around the drum kit. Well, the problem is, let's say you hit your snare drum. Your snare drum the sound will bounce out and it will hit all of your microphones at different times. Now, waveforms go up and down, and that's something you've probably seen before. And when you play that sound, the sound goes, let's say, it crests up first of all. And the first microphone, whether it's on the snare drum or the overheads, it hears the sound as it's going upwards. When you have another microphone, it might just be that the amount of time the sound has taken to travel to that next microphone has actually gone downwards and is impacting the mic when you're in the trough of that waveform. Now, what happens is when you play both of those microphones back together, the microphones are still so close as it's only milliseconds. Basically, it's roughly, for every foot sound travels, that's about a millisecond of delay. So what's effectively happening is the speaker is being asked to play both the same sound forward, the crest up, and it's being asked to pull back for the trough. Okay, so you've got a speaker being asked to move forward and back at the same time. What happens is nothing in a perfect world. Now, the reality is waveforms are very complicated and they're not perfect. It's unlikely. Not only is it unlikely it'll be a perfect tip of the crest and bottom of the trough, but also different frequencies will impact it at different times as well. So what tends to happen in reality is you hear phase relationships as a thinning of the sound, as something that sounds quite brittle, tinny, especially on low end sources. That's where it really kills, is kick drums, the bottom of your snare drum. They can, in a really bad situation, just sound like clicks. Most of the time, it just sounds like your kick drum doesn't have enough punch or thump or depth to it. So I've got only 4 tracks on here, just kick, snare, knee mic, which is a funny little mic that I place just underneath the snare drum, above the kick drum on the beta side, and that just kind of does double duty as sort of picking up another image of the kick drum and also kind of miking up the bottom of the snare drum, and just a mono overhead on these tracks. So let me open this and play you this little segment here. Let's see what it sounds like. And what I'm going to do is, now I've already checked this out, so I already happen to know that the overhead and the knee mic are actually currently out of phase. So I need to flip the polarity, which simply means that the waveform goes from, if it's cresting upwards and troughing down, it means that now it's going to be the trough first and then the crest on the waveform. It literally just flips that image. Interestingly, it won't make it sound any different in terms of if you listen to it in solo and flip the phase, flip the polarity. Flipping the phase is kind of incorrect. That you don't flip phase, you flip polarity. Although a lot of people do say flip phase, so hey, if you listen in solo, you won't really hear any sound difference flipping the polarity. But of course, in context with the other mics, you hear quite a noticeable difference. So this is one for headphones, definitely, or monitor speakers, full range. If you're listening on a phone, maybe just grab some headphones just to be able to really appreciate this. I'm going to play the little loop I've got set up and listen for the kick drum and the snare drum especially, because those two are the things where you'll really hear it. The kick drum, very much so. So let's have a little listen. How do we fix this? How do we get around to, like, oh, of course, you can see the fixes to flip the polarity. You can hear all that low end come into the kick drum. The snare drum sounds like it's actually got depth. But how do you actually get to the bottom of this problem? Because there's a few ways that you can approach this in terms of trying to determine whether you have any phase problems, because this is just 4 mics. What if you've got 12 mics on a drum kit? Ugh, like, that's quite challenging. Well, there are some plugins that you can use. So there's an auto align, phase auto align plugin, which is quite cool. You put that on multiple tracks and off you go. But what if you don't have access to that plugin? Or perhaps you just can't afford to buy that plugin at the moment. It's an excellent plugin. But yeah, we don't all have all the plugins all the time. Even if you have it at your studio, what happens if you go somewhere, maybe you're doing a live show and you don't have that plugin? So plugins are great, but it's helpful if you have another workflow. The other thing a lot of folks do is they will zoom in on their timeline. And let me show you what I mean here. So if I expand this view out, you can see, I mean, this one wonderfully is such a clear example of where phase can be a challenge. You can see we've got the crest here. Down here, you can see we've got a trough, but this is fundamentally the same sound. So this is the kick mic that's actually in the kick drum, and this is the kick mic, the knee mic that's on the other side of the kick drum. So normally, and it's not pointing at it, but it's pointing downwards, which means more or less it's going to be out of phase. When you have 2 microphones pointing at each other and the source it's picking up is in the middle, usually they are out of phase with each other. And that's just because, if you want to try and keep everything in phase, have the microphones facing the same direction so the sound impacts them all in the same direction. If they're opposite, you might think that it's impacting in the same direction. Aren't they both pushing? It doesn't work like that in reality. A really good example is snare microphones. If you put a microphone on the top and the bottom of a snare and hit it, you'll find this one almost always, in fact, I've never encountered it being in phase. It's always out of phase, assuming it's the same distance apart. So this is why we've got this little problem here, is this one is cresting upwards, this is a trough, problem. Now the overhead is a little bit later, and this is the second problem. Okay, so what a lot of people will do is they'll come in and they'll go, okay, no problem. Well, I can see, you can, I mean, it's a little hard to see here, but you can kind of see that this on the overhead probably should be where this is. But it's because the overhead is further away, and so there is a time delay. So not only are you dealing with a problem of crest up or trough, you're also finding that it's shunted forward on the timeline simply due to the delay of the amount of time it takes for the snare drum to hit the SM57, which is right on top of the snare drum, or go all the way up to, the roof and hit the overhead. The problem with sliding tracks is it actually spoils the effect of distance, especially if you start to use room mics. Now, that doesn't mean it necessarily sounds bad. It can be okay, but it will stop your brain registering as those mics being further away. You'll have the ambience of mics being further away or the overhead being further away, but you do lose some of that 3D depth that you get from displaced mics. Now, when you're dealing with multiple mics, you will always get phase problems every single time. And what we're really trying to do is solve the low end, because that's where you hear it mostly. Phase issues in the mid and the high end, they will simply be there. If you put 2 mics on a source, even if they're right next to each other, you're still going to have a tiny bit of time delay between frequencies right at the very top, because they're tiny. They're tiny, tiny, tiny little sounds. So we're not trying to remove phase problems, but here's the thing, nor do we want to, because a lot of this phase relationship is actually auditory cues for our ears to be able to hear where something is placed in an environment. So it's actually really important. But when it's so far out and it's like this, that's where we have a problem. So let me show you a really easy workflow to fix this. What I'm going to do is concentrate on this kick drum. And you can do this for any sound at all. All you do is you select a really small range. So for example, it could be a few pick notes on the acoustic guitar. Just make it really short. I'll show you how short this is. It's about a beat long. In fact, I'm actually going to pick a different hit, something that doesn't have, I think it's all got a little bit of cymbal in. So we'll just go with this. So it's a tiny short section. You can do it with electric guitar, whatever, but this makes it so easy to hear the problem. So I'm going to mute all of the other sounds and I'm going to just play the kick. All right, cool. Now what I do is, and what I recommend for getting this problem solved easily is just then unmute the overheads and make sure that both are, for this stage, for sorting out your phase issues, just make sure that your volumes are like, don't make sure that the overheads aren't really, really quiet because that's not helpful. Just make sure that you're, they're somewhat similar volumes so you can really hear what's happening. And if I pop over here and play that loop again, I'm going to press this polarity button and we'll flip it in and out and see if you can hear the difference in the kick drum. With the polarity in, the kick goes from like being a little higher pitch almost to feeling lower. And that's simply because we're getting more low end. And that tells me it's the low end you're listening for. That tells me that is more in phase than when the polarity is unflipped. Now let's try with the knee mic. And this is how I do it. I go, okay, well, I've done my overheads now. Let me check the other microphone in relation to my kick drum mic. Let's have a listen. And that's really very obvious. And of course, if we come back to, our waveforms here, it's of course a no-brainer. You can see the knee mic is completely, really, except for a tiny little bit of time shift, it's completely different. So yeah, if you just take a tiny section and then do this mute-unmute trick, you will find that you can get everything by ear in really good phase, and you just listen for the one that sounds better. Every once in a while, you will get something that's 90 degrees out of phase. So let's say here, this is almost 180 degrees out of phase because this is close to, it's a little bit out, but it's close to being the exact opposite. When you get something that's 90 degrees out of phase, which is a real pest, that is, as you can imagine, when, it's halfway down on the one and halfway up on the other. Just have a listen for which one sounds the best. In those cases, sometimes that can be helpful to slide a track a little bit, but use it as a last resort. It's also great if you have a phase auto align plugin and you can just throw that on and that will help you get those results as well. But don't rely on these other things. It's important to use your ears because plugins just do a machine-based operation. They're just making things correct by machine standards, which is not necessarily the same thing as something sounding creative and fun and exciting and compelling to listen to. So just be really careful when adjusting your phase with any automatic phase tool to make sure that it really is making the sound better. And that's basically how you fix it. Just go through, solo that kick drum, check the kick drum's kind of all right in the first place. You obviously want to check that your kick drum has bass in it, as sometimes you get a kick drum and, the heads are really loose or something and it doesn't have any actual boom to it. But once you've determined those things about the tracks, go ahead, just play, kick and overhead, kick and whatever other mics you've got, and phase line them. And normally, when you phase align them with one track and everything's in phase with that one track, often it will be in phase with everything else. Once in a while, you discover that something is tricky and it's out of phase, kind of 90 degrees opposites with a couple of different elements. Just go through and make your best judgment call on those things. But that is how to fix phase problems. You can check the waveform, just have 2 tracks playing at one time, flip the phase and listen for the low end. The low end is where you'll really identify this problem. So thank you so much for joining me for this little make your multi-mic'd tracks sound better video. I hope you have a wonderfully musical week. If you are interested in learning more about mixing, I have a free 6-step mixing guide on my website, which is recordwithalex.com, and you can just download that for free. I give a whole bunch of tips in there about how to think about mixing, the sorts of things you're listening out for, and how to really have a system that you can follow that makes sure that you can get really cool mixes kind of every time. So I really appreciate you being here. Please like and subscribe. That makes a huge difference. And, let me know in the comments if you've ever struggled with any sort of multi-miking phase issues, and whether you didn't know what it was, or whether this video has made you feel like, now I understand, now I can go back and check my phase and see whether that's been an issue. Thank you so much. I'll catch up with you on a video next week.